this map. I'll explain this in a moment. Right, so I think the first thing at the beginning, this is good. Qualitative research, it's fantastic, but it's extremely time consuming. It's very difficult. And I think, you know, at the outset, it's kind of worth kind of asking yourself, why bother? And for me, it's an important question because my PhD is not in qualitative research and it didn't use those methods. My PhD is in the 17th century political philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who's by no means a household name. I doubt he ever will be. And it was very easy researching Spinoza because he'd written it all about 350 years ago. You simply needed to understand a bit of Latin, some of the concepts, and away you go. And qualitative research is completely different. It's unpredictable, it's complicated, it's time consuming, and it's going to have strange effects on your life. I'll go through these in a moment. I'm not trying to put you off, but it's important to know. Now, the immense values that it's had for me is the kinds of things that you can't get when you just read books or textbooks. You know, as familiar, as cozy, as reassuring, and sometimes as easy as they are. That this is the best way, sometimes the only way to understand people's frames and concepts, worldviews, values. But not only that, it's not just a way of trying to extract information out of people, and we'll get onto this. This is one of my key points. It's not just about extracting information. It's also about collaborating and testing ideas, learning from people's lived experience. And what you can do in these situations, especially the focus groups, is kind of think with, develop with, work with, co-produce in ways that are really exciting. You just can't do that in any other format. So it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, but it's antisocial and it's going to drive you mad. But if you want to make this sound a little bit grander, I think there's an important shift here from moving from the traditional forms of passive learning, you know, what we've been trained to do, the textbooks, the textual analysis, and this kind of active thinking on your feet, thinking through the lived experiences and values and emotions and words that people tell you. But lots can go wrong. So this is the bit. This is going to be mainly practical. I'll give you a little bit of framing of my research. Don't worry, I'm not going to knock you over the head with it. One of the things that I'll refer to briefly is this project that I've been doing over the last 9 months in East London, quite near where I live, about the impact of massive housing developments in one borough of East London, Barking and Dagenham. So you have, you know, what you can find when you look at local government planning reports, you know, tens of thousands of homes, as you see here in different areas. Maps where you get a kind of sense of what different ideas of growth might mean for different places. But then you have what that means for different communities and different people, different subjectivities, different standpoints within a given community, like Thames View, which you see here. And that's where the interviews come in. And it's really difficult because you've got to spend a lot of time thinking about what you want to find out, finding the right people and going about it very ethically and very carefully. And this, I'll give you some pointers. Again, I'm failing better as I go along, but I'll give you some pointers as we do this. Right, so why interview? I think there are two things to look at in this relationship. One is the kind of getting information, understanding participants, but also the collaboration thing, the partnership with your interviewees and focus group participants. And that's an ongoing process because often the work doesn't just happen, it's not just in the interview, it's all of the build up and the contact before the interview. It's the follow up that I think you should always do after the interview, before and after focus groups, and then always keeping people in the loop with what you do. But with that comes a lot of particular challenges. If the aim is to get information, you know, it's like a detective, then there's a lot that you need to do in advance. Preparation, practice, I'll talk about that in a second. An interview guide, I'll give you an example in a moment, but it'll be on the slides. And self-care, that's maybe something that we'll talk about in the Q&A. And when you think about collaborating with others, there's a lot of ethical elements to this as well. I'm going to get to this too. We will talk about ethics. Right, so I think this kind of practical stuff follows 4 points. So the first, when approaching qualitative research, is laying the groundwork. Don't worry, it's not gonna be all completely obvious stuff, but I think just let's start with the obvious thing. Doing interviews, doing focus groups is going to be immensely time consuming for you. It's also going to be immensely time consuming for whoever you're trying to speak to. And it's going to be time consuming when you're reaching out to different people in the community, different stakeholders, different gatekeepers, if you're going to use them. In a sense, they're going to want to know, why should they waste their time with this or give up their time with this? And that's not just because your project is cool and important. In a way, you've really got to think and prepare quite a lot in advance about what it is you really need to get out of that 1 hour when you're interviewing somebody, or that 2 hours when you're in a focus group with 4 or 5 others. Really spend a lot of time thinking about this. It's not just in terms of getting it down for yourself, it's also in terms of the story that you are going to tell, that you should tell when you meet people, when you make yourself visible in different community settings or different gatherings. It depends on the kind of group that you're working with. So you need to not rush this and work this out in advance. There are tons of good books about doing qualitative research. I've put one link there, and I'll show you a picture of it in a moment. And it allows listening to people, which is absolutely fantastic. It's got tons of practical guidance. So if you start zoning out in a minute or two, just make sure you've written this down and just look up this book later. It came out, I think, last year. It's very, very good. Lots of places do training. I've got an example there. I'll show you a link in a second. I've just done it for research methods. One thing that I think is very important as you're developing this project, you know, even approaching this as PhD students, is try and meet with others who are working in a broader similar area. You'll be surprised. Often senior academic colleagues, you know, their favourite things to talk about are pet projects. And so, you know, don't be shy in reaching out to people, let them know what you're doing, find out from their experiences. And one thing that you can do is ask them if they can share their transcripts if they're willing to do that. And the last one, I think this is very useful if you haven't done much interviewing before, is practice on your sorry relatives. You know, you can role play, you know, you could ask them to kind of role play and give them a bit of information in advance. But I think it's really useful getting used to doing that and getting used to practicing recording people, because actually it's quite awkward recording somebody. It's quite awkward going through the questions. It's quite awkward trying to remember what your questions are, but not always fumbling and looking at your notes. The practice, you know, for me, it really helped when I started doing this. These are the things that I recommend, especially the book. Okay, what else? Right, as you're laying the groundwork, you need to remember that this is going to be really time consuming. I'm sure your PhD supervisor will have talked to you about this already, but it's just worth reinforcing. A lot of the preparation is going to take a lot more time than you think. Open University have a very rigorous ethics review process, HREC. Expect revisions to come through. Give yourself months for this, not weeks. As part of your field work, again, it's your manner. It's about how you do it. But for me, I like to take my time, and I really see it as all about relationship building. So if I'm looking to do, like, let's say my project in Barking and Dagenham, or enough project that I did with unpaid carers in Gateshead, what I did is I had 4, 5, 6 trips beforehand, just going up, meeting people, walking around the place where you work and get a sense of the area, shopping in the supermarket, riding on local buses, to try and get into the world, you get into kind of the lived world of people. And I think you need to give yourself time for this. It can be expensive in terms of travel costs. That's a whole other thing. Yes, I've got there about the field work. What else? Yeah, interviews are time consuming. You know, even if you look to do your best two a day, you're going to need to factor in all the time for travel, meeting people, a bit of break time afterwards. Transcription, it takes an awful long time. Dissemination and an ethical exit. Maybe we'll come back to this in the Q&A, but I think one thing to think about with your work, no matter what you're doing, even if you're only looking to interview a small amount of people, is that it's not just when we approach people, let's say you want to do work with, I don't know, kids in a secondary school, or you want to do work with social workers, or you know, work with people in long-term relationships. You're going to enter and be opened up to people's lives in quite a deep way. It's sometimes in a very disarming way. People are strangely, I find, very open with strangers, and it's amazing what people will say to me after a long interview. You know, I've not told family members this. This actually comes with a self-care element. You need to make sure sometimes that you're ready and that you allow break time and recovery time after interviews, but you're really going to get to know people and they're going to trust you, hopefully. And what that means is you shouldn't scoot off once you've done your work. It's all about building those relationships and taking time to leave carefully. Well, maybe we'll talk more about that in the Q&A. That for me is quite important with the work. Whew, okay, we're going for this quick. In the field, this is the practical stuff. Oh no, this is the relationship stuff. Okay, this is more about recruitment, really. I think when you're trying to recruit interviewees, remember that lots of people don't want to take part initially. People are busy. People are kind of wary of universities and academics, believe it or not. And people are wary and sometimes intimidated by authority. There's a power relationship here that you need to consider. One way that I found that's really effective for recruiting people is to do short videos. I know when you're going through the ethics review process, you'll have to do an information sheet, which is often very long, and people in my experience never read it. But if you produce a short video, create a web page, the Open University, I think, can do this. They've done it for me. I think try and keep an open mind that when you go into your project, in a way, you've got a sense, you know, you've talked with your supervisors. This is what I'm looking to find out. These are my concepts. This is the case study. Here are the problems. But keep an open mind and be ready to be surprised by what people tell you about what you think you should find out. And I think be flexible as you go along. That's the joy of this sort of work. This is an example of a little OU webpage for my Barking and Dagenham stuff. I've put some nice little colourful maps. that I did on, messed about with on the internet. I made a little video. That's just me cycling around the area doing these, film stuff on the camera, kind of TikTok stuff. Okay, right, yeah, in the field. So, okay, let's say we go. You've managed to get some interviewees. Great, well done. Next steps. Now, it really depends on how you want to approach this, on your resources and what you can do. Some academics and researchers will disagree on whether you should give a gesture of thanks, possibly you could describe it as paying your interviewees for their time in shopping vouchers. Some say you shouldn't do it because it's an inducement. I mean, there's good arguments for and against. I think that if you're not going to pay people, or if you're not able to pay people, then a small gesture of thanks, like bringing some homemade vegan cake, gluten-free cake, or something like that, is always a nice gesture. Always thank people for their time. Let people know what you're doing and why it matters. Just that power stuff. Maybe we'll come back to that. Right, practicalities. Okay, here's the one thing that I've really screwed up with in the past, and it's so important. Bring 2 good recorders, not one good recorder and one bad recorder. You'll have a dictaphone, and you can also record on your phone if you put it in airplane mode, and have an app for it. But you really you're going to be transcribing this later, or you're going to be listening to recordings later. Spend £100 on a good dictaphone at the start, just please. I've used bad dictaphones, and it's absolute misery spending hours and hours transcribing. Get yourself 2. When you're doing the interviews, don't overfill the day, especially if you're working with a gatekeeper organisation where they're offering you a space or they're charging a room hire fee. They'll approach it as a logistics thing, like, oh, you want to speak to 4 people? Great, you can do 4 people, one after the other. This is a bad idea for you because you will be too tired and you will forget. You won't be able to kind of really get into what people are saying. So never do too many in one day. Lots of people are going to cancel. Get used to it. Don't be bothered about it. You can also, it's easy to reschedule. Phone interviews work well. Microsoft Teams. I've got the image of the Churchill nodding dog there. Okay, maybe that's a reference that not all of you will get if you're younger than me. But when you are transcribing, what you're not going to want to have to go through is you going, oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Please continue. That's, of course, we're human beings. It's what we're going to do, but it's actually quite annoying. It's annoying to transcribe. So if you can, it's a hard one to remember because I do it all the time. But remember to try and minimize your own answers except for the ones that really matter. Here's a little trick as well. You're going to get interviews that really ramble, or they bring up a personal story which you want to get it back on track, or some people might go on a bit of a diatribe about politics or some kind of issue which you're not really sure is really relevant. There's a nice little trick that you can do during the interviews where you say, hold on a minute, can I just summarize where I think we've got to so far? Well, I think you're saying this and saying that. If we could please come back to this, and then you get yourself back in queue. I call it the summary. Now, when you're in the room, I'm sorry, there's so much. I'm blasting you with information here. The aim really is to dig deep. Remember when I said before, why are you taking up their time with interviews? There's a lot of things that you can find out yourself, by doing your own analysis of demographics or whatever. So what you're really looking for in these interviews, it depends on your top subject, but you're looking for people's subjective experiences and emotions about given things. And there are different ways that you can approach this in your questions. Often what you want is detail. You're not really looking for generics because they're not really that useful, or they don't really help you make a point or understand the point. So these are kind of examples of prompts you can use. Can you tell me more about that? I think that's interesting to come up with if you're looking at a given issue. So let's say that the Barking and Dagenham stuff is about housing. I did a couple of interviews last week, and people in different ways are talking about their pain and sadness because their children are leaving the area because they can't afford to live there. And so they give you a 5-minute description of a daughter going to university, and then talking a bit about how they're not going to see her as much. Often what you're looking for is what that feels like, or how a person understands that. So you can say, well, how did that make you feel when? Or what word would you use to describe this? Another good prompt, and it does take practice, is to be silent, which is really awkward, isn't it? Because I'm just talking at you right now, whereas maybe a bit of silence would allow you to take this in. And silence can be a good thing at different points. You can use it to embed or kind of share in a difficult moment. I think it's always worth transcribing silences. But silence can also be a prompt. Somebody might tell you something and you're aware that they're holding something back, or there's more to it. So you just be awkwardly silent. You'll get more that way. I think it's like producing music interviews and focus groups. Really good ones. You really feel that you're sharing something quite important. People call it rapport, but I see it as a kind of an authentic kind of connection or mutual understanding. One thing that I would say is, as part of your practice, you'll produce an interview guide, which you probably have looked at already, but if not, I'll show you one in a second, and it'll be on the slides. But really make sure that you can remember your questions in your mind so that it is an authentic conversation, especially when you think about the power element. If you're interviewing quite marginalised people and they see you with all your notebooks and dictaphones, smart clothes, and printed pages everywhere, it's going to, it might make people kind of close up and feel like they're talking to somebody at the job centre or the council. I think for that authenticity, it's very important that you try and remember the questions. It doesn't really matter if the order changes, in my view. You can always come back to stuff. Here's an example of my interview guide. There's a couple of really good ones in the Annette Lauer book. An interview guide is basically like a really detailed kind of setting out of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. You kind of summarize the spiel that you'll say at the beginning. You've got your questions, but also think of the probes and the follow-up questions that you might ask. And I'll give you an example here. This is from the work that I did with unpaid carers in Gateshead. I was really interested in how unpaid carers have been impacted by the cost of living. So one guy here, obviously everyone's names get changed, Khalil, was talking about not being able to switch on his heating last winter. So I asked him, what was that like? How did that feel like? And then he came up with this line which is quite moving. He said that it felt like we were broken, financially broken. And it's not just a lived experience, it's kind of phrases and words like that can often, especially when you're talking to policymakers, really persuade them, because often they, you're a PhD student, you're an academic, what do you know about these things? But when your interviews are putting it in their own words that are ways of powerful and relatable, then that becomes a lot more persuasive than our graphs, or maybe a combination of them. And this is enough for one. Okay, right, focus groups. I'll be fairly quick, because I think I know I've gone over 10 minutes at this stage. For me, I think the real value of them is that you have to structure them much more carefully. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A, because people will really waffle on. But I often find it's a very useful way of building on interview experiences and ideas from the interviews, and actually using them to share and test out ideas and observations that you've made in the interviews. What I do in my focus groups, because I am hopeless at drawing and creative stuff, is I use lots of maps, and I create maps with people. The one on the left is a massive printout of a map of Barking at the beginning of the project. And I ask people to use different coloured post-it notes to talk about the strengths of where they live, the challenges of where they live, and the things that they'd like to see in the future. And we kind of create a map over that. The one on the right is about a landscape of care, the things that unpaid carers need. You see, the NHS, GP and so on. You've got your pink post-it notes of the problems and the orange are the positive changes. There's all sorts of ways you can do this. Okay, right. After all that, there's still a lot more work to do. I think one thing that I really wish I'd done at the beginning of my qualitative research is write memos straight after. Even do it, if you're knackered, after a long day, even if it's 2 a.m. Or it's, you can do it in whatever form you want, but write a note on your phone, a summary of what came up in the interview, your thoughts, your key moments. You will be so grateful that you've done this later. Keep a journal. You can use the journal in the research. Some of you I'm sure you're probably doing this already. Transcription, off to AI, don't do it. It's a waste of money and it comes out so poor, unless you're interviewing people who are from the United States or South Africa, in which case it comes out pretty well, in my experience. There's a thing called Whisper AI, which might be useful in the future, but it seems untested, dubious in how it works. But I think that's just to keep something on your radar. When you're working through transcripts, you're going to get hundreds of thousands of words. So it goes back to time. This is so time consuming, but it's so much more alive and worth it. As part of your work, always check in with people afterwards. Get in touch maybe a few days after the interview to thank them for their time and let them know what's happening next. And update them as you go along, especially when the line goes dead, which is going to be when you're transcribing and analysing your data. People won't hear from you for months, so let them know that you haven't forgotten them and that you're working on this. I think people it's part of the trust and the care of the work. Yep. Okay. The final point I'll say, again, others might disagree. I think there's a part of our professionalism. This is us. We're Open University people, and we also kind of in a way represent academics in higher education when we're dealing and working with people. Is that I think we should try and offer people as much control over the transcripts as we can. So I normally send it back to people after and put track changes on, say, if there's anything that you want to remove out of this cleaned up transcript, so I will have anonymized it and removed all the personally identifying material already, you have to do that anyway. But you send it back to them and say, is there anything else that you want to take out of this? And actually it's interesting, people will take out more sometimes. It's disappointing when they do, in a way. I did a fantastic interview where somebody was talking about the impact of unpaid care on their sister. And this carer said to me, I want all of the mention of my sister removed from this. Okay, it's part of the trust and part of the control. And when I've done the report or film, or when we did the film later, allow time for multiple stages where you can send something back to whoever's been involved and say, I'm going to present your story like this, or I picked out this quotation. Do you think that fairly represents what you're doing? They might say no, and you might have a reason for doing what you're doing, but I'd say give as much control as you're able to give. Okay, that was not like a good interview because I talked at you really quickly, but I'll stop there.
Talk about one study that the PowerPoint that I've shared brings together 3 studies, but I want to just focus on one study, and the reason that's important is to actually give you a flavour of what qualitative multiple methods are like. What they do actually involves drilling down. So I'm going to give you a really drilled down, refined look at some of the stuff that I've been doing on couple relationships. And just so you know, this was funded by the Economic and Social Research. It was a very large scale study, and it took place quite a few years ago now, but is something that I continue to work upon. Shuffling paper, sorry, so I can get to the buttons. So the Enduring Love study set out to look at how couples experience, sustain, and perceive long-term relationships, long-term couple relationships, intimate relationships. Romantic relationships. So what we wanted to do, and there was a team of researchers, I was the principal investigator, but we had several co-applicants, and also a handful of researchers who were doing a lot of the qualitative data generation as well. So we wanted to design a research project that could look at the whole spectrum of feelings and experience. And that's because I truly believe we live in the world through our emotions, through our feelings, as much as through actions. So I wanted to sort of develop, and have done over the last 30 years, to develop this psychosocial multisensory research approach. And that's because we wanted to situate emotions at the conceptual and methodological and analytical heart of our research, to access and portray the vibrant and visceral accounts of relationships. And to this end, we deployed this research design. We had a quantitative survey. We ended up with about 9,000 people doing that survey, but I'm not going to touch upon that today because I want to focus on the qual stuff. But that survey was designed to scope trends in behaviour, and it's still there, archived on the website for Enduring Love Project, so you can actually go and check it out as well if you want to. Just ask me anything by email later about that, or in the later session. But the qualitative study itself enabled us to interrogate the minutiae and mundanities of relationships. So I'm absolutely fascinated in the smallness of things that we do, because I truly believe that's how we actually build up our experience. It's not all about big things that we do. It's not all about epiphanies and grand gestures. It's actually about the everyday and the ordinary. And through that, we can start to look at patterns of everyday relationship experience. And that's both the everyday and the ordinary and the small in terms of the experience of participants, but also in terms of the data that we generate through our research. So the methods that I used in this study are diaries, and they generate temporal data, so daily routines and processing of everyday actions. Emotion maps, and that's a method I devised many, many years ago now, and that's about situating where these things are happening, and in this instance at home, to look at the emotional dynamic of relationships and to look at the spaces of everyday coupledom as they are lived. And then biographical interviews, because for me it's always been about relationships. If you just do an interview, then what you've got is a snapshot. You've got a moment in time. So I'm really fascinated about how we can think about capturing experience over life course, when actually what we're talking about is a 1 to 2 hour window. So to think about how we can dig into those biographies of lived experience. And then collage and couple interviews. And that's because if you're interested in the social and cultural narratives, for example, then it's a good way of getting couples to, or different interview participants, to talk to one another, to look at how they make sense of cultural scripts. Really quick overview of qual research, as I say, because Dan's done such a fantastic job. It's rich and illuminating. It focuses attention on the micropolitics and personal dynamics of everyday experience and lived life. And it is, by its methodological nature, overridingly small scale. It's often structured around tightly defined cohorts, so our sample, which are often characterised by age, parental status, relationship status, sexual practice, for example, in my research, or in terms of like Dan's research about demographic factors where people live, for example. And the focus of qual research, therefore, generates significant understanding of how lives are lived, but generalizability remains limited. And it's something we talk about and you read about in qualitative research. And I've examined and I've supported lots of PhD students, and we often get several pages of justification, and they're quite defensive about our small scales. You know, I only interviewed 10 people, I only interviewed 20 people. And I think it should be accepted that qualitative studies are about looking at individual, group experience, social context, phenomenon, but the specificity of findings is what's crucial. And their purpose is to really drill down, to think about what the individual experience might be, or to think about that, the specifics. And it's not a limitation. That is the quality of qualitative research. It's the thing that it does really well, and we shouldn't feel defensive about that. That is its purpose. So for the rest of this, and trying to keep to 10 minutes, might go a bit over, I'm going to focus on the research design that we used in the Enduring Love study, as I said, but also to just do one case study. So one couple and actually one person in that couple, and just show you a glimpse of their data. So I'm going to look at a couple called, her name was Samara and her partner, and they're a heterosexual couple, and they're both in their 20s, and they're both in full-time employment. And they're starting out on their life together, and they've recently bought their first home, and they're what we might call the first blush, the honeymoon period of married life. And in many ways, they embody the couple norm. Now, the reason I'm showing you this case study is I truly believe you can't have any hope of understanding qualitative methods unless you actually see data, because that's where they come to life. That's where everything you thought about, I really want to study this, suddenly becomes really exciting and gets you engaged. And it's why you do, as Dan says, spend 60, 70 hours a week working on it, as opposed to, you know, your 10, 20 hours that you might do if it wasn't so engaging. So across their data, both partners worked hard to sustain the picture perfect of the ideal couple and the relationship dream that they're striving to achieve. In the diary, which this is an extract here, Samara describes a traditional homecoming scene. It's consciously crafted and highly gendered, and she depicts herself as the homemaker and her husband as the capable breadwinner. It's as close to, you know, the heteronormative couple as you could possibly get. And, you know, dinner's cooked for her and it's waiting for him when he comes home from work, and it's perfect, her words, just us and food. Food's always a big thing in relationships. And alongside the diary, Samara also included a sketch and a caption and a photograph, which I'm not showing for reasons of anonymity. And the photograph depicts Samara and her partner walking in front of the camera, cutting a path through the middle of long grass. They're striding out proudly and confidently. She's in her Wellingtons, which are new. And it's a beautiful image. And Samara's partner then actually displayed it stored and digitally enhanced on his Instagram and as the background on his phone. And it personally signifies their relationship, the time they invested and their life adventure together. It said everything. They absolutely were, you know, this moment in time was distilled by this image. And the tale recounted in her diary and its visual portrayals have a childlike quality. The draws on the trope of fairy tales, and it's reminiscent really of grim fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel. The picture perfect walk with sunny skies, a pretty lake, and then that morphs into this scary scene with tall grass as tall as the woman, and the disorientation, getting lost, encroaching darkness, all really gets scary, and then her hero husband comes to save the day. So in some ways, and that sounds like I'm being really superficial or maybe even a bit sarcastic, but I'm not, because the whole point of this is there's a subtext, and the subtext begins to emerge through the rest of the data. So it's the heroism of her husband, which actually is a theme, but it's also something which starts to unravel, and you can see why she was using it. So the other method, emotion map, that I mentioned at the beginning, completed during the same time as the diary, is this emotion map. And The visual data here, like the diary data, appear to represent a happy, carefree couple who share the pleasures of contented coupledom. They're dining, they're walking out, they're sharing a laugh, they're dancing. Dancing was a big thing in the study. And they've got their pet dog here and they're dancing with the dog. And again, this is a picture-perfect relationship and it's great. But the relationship itself, all the pieces that you're starting to build up through these multiple methods start to fall apart. So they don't piece together neatly as you put things together. So Samara starts to talk about the dancing dog, the happy couple scene, and she tentatively begins to unveil how she supports her partner with his regular bouts of mental poor health. You know, she says, I'm reaching breaking point, and yeah, he got a bit down in the dumps, so I'm trying to make the best to make him happy. I'm dancing like a clown in front of him, trying to make him smile, but it's not working. So we've got all of these different facets of this story. And the research methods that I'm showing here in the emotion map here is specifically designed to situate emotions at the heart of studies. We're looking at using emoticons and emojis, which actually are emotion-centered, and they depict the dynamic of interpersonal relationships that are grounded in the immediacy of lived experience where they're happening. So whether it's in the bedroom, the living room, the kitchen, whatever. And then people are talking about what they happened, where they happened, why, and that life story approach starts to then unfold. So as we look across all of these data so far, you've got some interview data, you've got emotion map data, you've got diary data, and you look across all of those multiple methods data, what we begin to see is that Samara and her partner are sustaining each other in their relationship through a range of what we call in relationship science of relationship maintenance behaviours. And that involves a whole load of people and a whole load of activities. Another, the final one I'll talk about here, another of the methods that we used were couple collages. So this is where the couple are interviewed together, and we're looking at cultural images of relationships. So in their joint interview, they're talking about the sex and intimacy collage, and the couple start to work hard with Samara taking the lead to reforge the picture of harmonious together. So she unraveled it, saying, you know, we've got poor mental health, it's really difficult. And then she starts to try and build it back up. And this is important because this is the last method. So as Dan said, when you're doing qualitative research, and especially the sort of work I do, which is really digging down deep into people's personal relationships, you need also to take them back out of the relationship. Otherwise, you're leaving them high and dry and stranded in this emotionally fraught scenario in many ways. So you're trying to also then present third-party scenarios so that people can find a way both in their relationship, but then come out of their relationships to think about the broader picture. So the data here about how the couple aspire to what type of relationship and the values that they hold dear. And it's also to think about the disjuncture between their values of what makes a good relationship and how they're doing it. So here they're talking about the shared activities that they sit on the bench and read papers together. So it's couple time together where they're also apart, etc. And they also emphasise very clearly the need to make time for the relationship. It isn't just that you fit it into the gaps. You actually have to actively make time for each other, yourselves, and the relationship as a third entity. So it's almost like there are three parts in the relationship. And so what this sort of palette of qualitative methods did is that it allowed us to think about the moments of intimacy and the interactions that couples ordinarily go through on their everyday lives together, both within the couple dyad and beyond it. And to sort of round off, I want to throw a few things out there, really. And yes, for couple relationships, it is about everyday gestures. It's about ordinary acts and thoughtfulness. And I think that'd be the same of every single topic that I've ever seen, ever researched. For me, what's really interesting isn't the big things, it's the small things. So like Dan was saying there about somebody talking about the financial hardship, it isn't, let's talk about the topic of financial hardship. It's about saying, this is how it felt to me. It was crippling. It was, absolutely everything in my life at that moment. So I think it's also about how people come out of that and experience that. And qualitative multiple methods are useful for that because they become reflexive sites that are shaped by and in turn shape the public and the private context that surround them. Experience is embodied, it's contextually located in both place and space and biography. It's steeped in emotions, and it manifests and is reconfigured and configures over time, past, present and future. What qualitative multiple methods do, the different methods, is they generate different facets of experience. And I'm there thinking some of the words of Jennifer Mason, who writes about facet methodology. So you can use multiple methods to shine a light on different dimensions of an experience and different dimensions of knowledge, and then bring those together. But I want to also pose the really thorny problem that we have with multiple methods that I really don't think is we've cracked it, and I have been writing about it for 30 years, and I certainly don't think I've cracked it yet, is how you analyse qualitative multiple methods. So it's all very good saying I've got diary data, I've got pictures, I've got photographs, I've got interviews, I've got emotion maps, I've got a couple collages, I've got all of these fantastically rich data sources. But how do you bring all of those sources together? You can't easily analyse thematically an emotion map with an interview. So how do we actually bring those together? And I think we're all guilty in qualitative research if we use all of these fantastic qualitative methods and then we analyse the interviews that are done around those methods. So we get people to talk about the qualitative images that they've produced. We get them to talk about participatory methods, whether it's theatre or whatever. We're actually talking about then how people articulate again. And I think we need to think more carefully about how we can engage with the specificity of experience and the specificities of emotion, and think more creatively about what is there beyond the spoken word. And what we did, and I have started to do over the last 10 years or more now, is to think about using moments. So I've called that telling moments as an analytical starting point. I find thematic analysis more limited. It's because that's good at the big broad brushstrokes, but actually how do we get down to how people do really experience their embodied experience, their felt experience? So I use moments, and that is like an incidental, oh, they brought me a cup of tea. You know, why was that suddenly so interesting? So it really is something that I drill down into these ordinary everyday points to look at the wider social phenomenon. So I start with individual moments. I start with these small fragments of experience, like the walk through the wood for Samara. And then I come out of that to think about norms of coupledom. So it's starting the other way around, rather than thinking, oh, what are the norms of coupledom? And I've got data on that, and going back down to illustrate those through experience. I look at those minutiae of everyday experience and then build those out into the thematic, into what does that tell us about the norms of traditional heteronormative coupledom. And I've got here, and it's in the slides, so I'll not stay on it, but some references here. And when I talked about using moments, there's that reference there, telling moments, that I wrote with my co-researcher, Janet Fink, which was in sociology. So, oh my gracious, 9 years ago. And that's where I talk more about using this approach of focusing on the everyday, but looking at that small fragments of experience. So I'm going to leave it there.